I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. There are going to be discussions of sexual violence, colonization, and racial discrimination in this episode. If that's not something you feel like you can listen to right now, I won't blame you if you skip this one. So before I go into my usual intro, I want to state at the beginning that I am not a history or a news podcast, that this is a place where I do film analysis, media analysis through a queer lens. Because I'm going to be discussing real people's lives to an extent, especially considering the ongoing conflict in Gaza, I will defer to people smarter than me to talk intelligently about colonization and genocide. I personally don't feel capable doing that. And like I said, this is a film podcast, so I will reference stuff that I feel is relevant, but I am going to be specific to the film in this case. I've put resources in the description if you feel that there are gaps in my knowledge, which there will inevitably be, for just information about what's going on in the world at the moment, including places you can donate your time and money towards the Free Palestine movement. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema. So it has been a bit since we've done a main episode. So this year is season 3 of the podcast, where I have decided to, throughout the year, discuss films that are non-English language films from around the world. And the film I've decided to discuss today is quite pertinent at the moment, and one of the few queer films that I was able to find where I'd be able to have a lot to say about it. It's a very complicated film, which I will get into. But yeah, today's film is In Between.
Drinking, partying, and smoking. Trends of everyday life that you would consider normal in the lives of young women. But new film Bar Bahar has caused controversy and outrage in the Muslim communities of Israel. The film depicts 3 young Arab women who live in the liberal city of Tel Aviv and their struggles against the rule-bound Arab world and their inequality in the Israeli world.
The message I want to transmit is that it's time for women to speak up. Until now, we were listening to men, and they were the ones running everything. The time has come for women to take the lead.
The message that I want to transmit to the Palestinian society is that we are very, very strong women. We're not defective. Our voice is not defective, neither are our acts, nor our responsibilities and decisions.
Bar Bahar has received a terrible backlash from the Muslim community. The mayor of the conservative town of Al-Fam, shown in the film, has called on it to be boycotted, as he believes it does not reflect the values of his town.
Our take on the movie is that it distorts the image of Al-Fam as a city, as a society, and as an Arab society living in Israel. It portrays our young men and women, it distorts their reputation, it shows them in an immoral and indecent way.
Despite the critics, the film has generated a lot of interest and has already been rewarded at international festivals.
In Between is a 2016 drama written and directed by Saloon Hamoud, following 3 Palestinian women living in Tel Aviv and trying to negotiate the gendered expectations of their society, balancing the weight of tradition and modernity on their shoulders. All 3 characters, Salma, Layla and Noor, have to come to terms with the way they are perceived as Arabic women and what freedoms can be available to them under the shadow of colonization. Transgressive in many ways, with criticisms of religion and its misogynistic violence coming from an Arabic perspective rather than from the white feminism of many Western critics. The film was controversial on its release, with a fatwa being issued against the film for its depiction of women smoking, drinking and partying. This is furthered by the way it depicts the line many people have to toe when expressing their gay identities, and how the closet is conceived in very religious communities. It won quite a few awards. I'm going to mention a few here. So it won a Network for the Promotion of Asian Cinema Award for World or International Asian Film Premiere at the 2016 International Film Festival. So there's so many words, I apologise. It also won 3 awards at the San Sebastian Film Festival. It has a Rotten Tomatoes critic score of 98% and an audience score of 77 and a Letterboxd score of 3.7. The reviews I have today are quite straightforward, which is to be expected with this kind of drama, I think. There's a lot to discuss in terms of what the film is doing, but for the most part, I think for a Western audience, I'd say this is very accessible film, and the response from within Palestine has been varied, I think. But I am going to discuss like the line of what has been available for Palestinian filmmakers to do with their cinema, and I guess like the way people like me may come to take that for granted. But first, I'll delve into these reviews. The first review I'm going to talk about is by Lexi, who said, "All women in the world deserve to do whatever they want, be free and know their worth. It's not easy to break free from a patriarchal and religious society's expectations for women, but possible if we fight for our rights and we have people who understand and support us. I love how these women have each other's backs." I'd say that if my saloon, Hamoud, heard that review, she'd be like, "You got the film, like, spot on." There's like a line between something being genuinely transgressive and empowering and being like a girl power movie, if you know what I mean. There was something very nice and sweet about the way these women just grew to protect one another, even if like they are quite different in terms of personality and what they expect from their lives. That really was the strongest part of the film. I felt their friendship as like very well performed and very well written. I believed that these women would do anything for each other, and I thought that was very nice. So this next one is from Silent Dawn, who says, "Doesn't really have a beginning or end, instead content to float along a series of feminist waves marking their sly fuck-off impressions on the sands of mediocrity and oppression. Utterly liberating and truthful, even down to the chilling final image." I don't know that I have that much to add, really. There is something quite grounded in the film. So if I compare it to Blue is the Warmest Colour, which is the last episode that I did on this podcast, that is a film that is trying very hard to convince you that this is down to earth and real, that I personally just never took away from it. Whereas this film, the tedium of the everyday, the small misogynies on top of the very big misogynies that the film explores, I think they were just like very nicely woven in. And I concur that the final shot of this film is just kind of upsetting, kind of devastating, because patriarchy doesn't end just because you succeeded in this one small feat against misogyny. It continues because what can 3 women on their own really do? So in a sense, I think that Hamoud's film is a call to action in a very real way. Like, if we look at it within a real world context, I don't feel as though Palestinian women have had many avenues to just talk candidly about their lives in Tel Aviv within their own religions and what's like expected of their lives. I think the ending, I'm not spoiling it. It feels as though it's like an ellipses. So like a ... somebody else continue on with this, please. This can't be the only film like this that's made. And I thought that was really interesting. The last review is from Sophie, who said, "Help, I spent the entire film entranced by Muna Hauer's hair and magnetic presence." Muna Hauer plays Layla, and she is honestly one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life, and this character is just like, I don't want to detract from the subject of the film or like take away from her as a person, but she is just like so hot. And I think it's like, it adds to the experience. Obviously these are like very beautiful women and I like following their story, but also just like there is like a sense that Layla has this image about her where she has to be the first one to step up. She has to be the one to take the lead. And I don't know that she gets that many opportunities in her life to be vulnerable. And I think the way that she looks is a big part of that. There's a lot to talk about here. I'm willing and ready to dive right in. I'm going to give a spoiler warning because I don't feel like enough people have watched this film. So I am going to talk about details from the film. So if you haven't seen it and it is something that has interested you, either from my description or looking it up on IMDb, then you can either just let me talk about it and spoil it a bit for you and see if you're still interested, or you can pause this episode and go away, watch the film and come back.
Palestinians, Israeli citizens, that gives us more challenges and specific conditions because we are second-class citizens inside Israel that get more and more racist and discriminated among us. So as a part of that generation and scene, we can call that underground scene specifically, I thought that it's the time for put all that stories in the front and give them representation. And we have a lot of stories, as you just said, that we didn't start even to talk about. And this is a kind of turning point inside the Palestinian and Israeli cinema.
What I'm going to talk about first is probably the thing about this film that I personally find the most controversial, and that I definitely saw criticisms of, but because there was a fatwa issued against the film, people kind of focused more on that rather than something that I believe is like probably more controversial, especially considering current events happening in the world right now. So in order to make this film, Hamoud took money from the Israel Film Fund, and this is controversial for many reasons. If you are like very invested in not supporting the state of Israel as an entity in any sense, then taking money from them to make a film is bad. But also because the state of Israel is pretty invested in presenting a specific image of itself, and it's one that is kind and progressive and definitely not very, very racist. So this kind of has to be taken into account. At the same time, what I don't want to do as someone who does not live there and is coming at this from living in the UK, and who I imagine is a fan of many directors who have taken money from different film funds that probably also have quite a bit of controversy involved within them. Like if a film fund or production company has a history of racial discrimination or sexual abuse, then a director taking money from them should also be something that I have a strong opinion on, right? And I think it's obviously a case-by-case basis, and I'm starting with this and not like all the details of the Israel Film Fund, because I want to make clear that my opinion is affected by, one, the focus that I'm doing on this film in particular. I can't really discuss the vague controversies of potential films that I haven't seen when I am discussing the actual controversies of a film that I have seen. And two, there can be like, especially with films coming from directors of colour, directors from different countries, there can be like a minute focus on the ways that their points of view, their worldview, doesn't conform with what I believe is right within my own value system, if that makes sense. Which is not to say that I like want to excuse controversies like this, but like I don't currently live under a fascist government. We're saying that loosely. We could, the UK could become a fascist government. Don't don't get me wrong. It could get there. Who knows? But I think there are circumstances under which is art more important than the value system of a particular production company or film fund, right? Can anything be produced ethically? These are all massive questions that I cannot answer. I just want to come at this from a place of understanding and also try to say in a measured way that I think taking money from a film fund that has been known to suppress or take funding away from movies that criticize the Israeli government is still worth talking about, whilst also not projecting xenophobic ideas of what directors from other countries should be doing, how they should be making their movies. All of this is a very long way to say that I have mixed opinions about this. I tend to lean more to, I want Palestinian directors to be able to make the movies they want to make, and I know that that can't be done without money. And as Hamoud has stated in multiple interviews, there is no kind of film funds to fund Palestinian directors. So she did an interview with Picadillo Pictures where she said, "I deserve to make films from the money I pay in taxes. I would have taken money from elsewhere in order to lift the cloud of a boycott, but there's nowhere else." In a further interview she did with Pop Matters, she said, "Every Israeli that took part in the process of the movie is from our side. The reality is it's a mixed scene, and in Tel Aviv it's a Jewish-Palestinian scene. The non-Zionist Jews are very close to us. We're like a family, we're all activists. So I believe this movie is another means of activism." I'm just going to give one more quote from another interview she did with The Film Experience, where she said, "When you think of Palestinian movies, you immediately think about movies about the conflict, the occupation. In the process of getting mature as a nation, we need to talk about Palestinians in Israel. It's our duty. So I didn't want to focus on the conflict in the West Bank or Gaza." So I lined those quotes all up on top of each other, just so I kind of gave the director a chance to explain how this came to be. I think it does beg the question, as an artist, how beholden are you to the money? Can the process of making a film be a form of activism? To what extent is your unwillingness to talk about the West Bank or the conflict, how far is that being influenced by the money that you're taking? I understand that wanting to have a film to appeal to a wider audience is going to involve not talking about horrific stuff like war and genocide, and hyper focusing on the micro. So having 3 characters who are living a fun modern life is going to be a lot more palatable to people who don't want to think about settler colonialism. So what responsibility as a director do you have to talk about this all the time? And I suppose weirdly, myself and Hamoud kind of fit in the same boat, because at the beginning of the podcast I said, I'm not a history podcast, I'm a film podcast, and I don't feel equipped to talk about the conflict in detail. So I'll talk about it when it comes up, but I'm not going to relay every detail. That's not what this podcast is for. And in the same sense, Hamoud has done the same thing. Her life, from what I've been able to glean from interviews, is very much like the life in the film. So she lives in Israel and is trying her best to negotiate her Arabic identity with a country that is trying to deny her rights as a person, and making this film is there to acknowledge that these people exist. I don't want to be conspiratorial, but it is kind of significant when you take money from a film fund that is going to be very invested in you not bringing up the conflict or the IDF or human rights violations or genocide. I'm going to talk about, to the best of my knowledge and with sources that I put in the description, how these film funds work and how this functions within Israel in particular. So the culture minister, Miki Zohar, pushed for new requirements that would force artists and filmmakers to guarantee their works not tarnish Israel's reputation or that of its military. The move was against the backdrop of planned reforms by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose government is believed to be the most right-wing regime in Israel's history. The Israel Film Fund and film funds like it are available to Israeli citizens and Palestinian Israelis who possess Israeli citizenship. What is required of them is that the films are categorized as Israeli in the context of international distribution structures, which focus on the primacy of Israeli cultural products over Palestinian films. They, as a film fund, will retain control over script content by withholding grant funds from filmmakers until a script receives full approval. If filmmakers refuse to make changes to the final script, then the film funds could withdraw financial support from the film. And I'm getting that information from an article in Variety and one in the Projector. With that in mind, where your money is coming from is just inherently going to affect how you choose to tell a story. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't a film coming from an authentic place. What I am saying is, if Maysalun Hamoud had chosen to tell a story about the conflict, about genocide, about the actions of the IDF, would she have been able to do that? The racial discrimination and xenophobia in the film is milder than the analysis of misogyny. And I think that's kind of deliberate, especially when Israel is very invested in pitting the modern world of Tel Aviv against the Palestinian communities, where they are not able to have a dominant voice over culture. There's like an investment in showing that racism and discrimination is confined to instances of like Salma not being able to speak Arabic at her job, and Layla telling one of her colleagues that they can't date each other because his mother wants to have a Jewish bride. There is less of a focus on the racial aspect, which is not to say that it's not there, but there have been films that have attempted to explore racial violence and the conflict that have come from Israeli directors that have been disavowed by the Israeli government. So I think there was a film called Foxtrot. I think that's what it's called. I haven't seen it, but I did read about it, and apparently the cultural minister was very unhappy and disavowed the film. It is unlikely that a film coming from inside Israel is going to be very critical of Israel, in the same way that it's still really hard for a film like being hypercritical of the British Empire to come from within the UK. It's very hard for a colonized nation to be able to be critical in the way that they maybe want to, when there's like a foot on their neck from a colonial body stopping them from doing that. I'm going to mention kind of briefly the BDS movement, which stands for Boycotts, Divestment and Sanctions, which I think is what Hamoud was talking about in the interview I mentioned earlier. So it's a form of non-violent pressure on Israel. It was inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, calling to pressure Israel to comply with international law, as in stopping them from occupying and colonizing Palestinian land, discriminating against Palestinian citizens, and denying Palestinian refugees the right to return to their homes. And all of that comes from the BDS movement website, which I'll put a link to in the description if you want to read more on what they suggest is to be done. But I'd say the kind of boycott that was being talked about falls into that, and I can't know what is in someone's heart of heart when it comes to how they feel about their decision to take money in this way. I did try to find a more recent interview with Hamoud. I wasn't really able to find anything on what like her opinion would be considering the events that kind of started around October. But this has been kind of an ongoing thing. And I know that she also took the opportunity to make a TV series in Israel as well. So my opinion is not to come from a particularly harsh place. I know that it's not easy to be an artist and also come from a marginalized background. But at the same time, I do think there is some kind of responsibility with your own values when it comes to making art. It's very hard for me to defend this decision. I think that's what it comes down to. It's not that I don't think what's happening on screen is still quite radical, but it was very hard for me to just forget about everything that's going on in the world and enjoy the film as a film, especially when one of the first things you see is Israel Film Fund. And I put it at the front here, like the first thing we talk about, because I wanted to talk about like the conceptions of Palestine and what it kind of means to represent Arabic womanhood within this context. So I think one of the first instances of colonization within film form is the film having the names of the actresses and their character names, and then scribbled over the top in Arabic are the names again. So we have this balancing of multiple languages and the extent to which they can be spoken in the real world and the extent that they can be portrayed to the audience. And there is like a self-awareness that this film is mostly going to play to people who know English or whose first language is English. There is a desire to appeal to that. I think at the same time, there is this balancing act of Arabic women where they're having to exist in these two spaces. And in the instance of this film, it's in a space of a colonized land that is simultaneously your home, but is also unaccepting of you as a person. This is like furthered by Salma not being able to speak Arabic in her workplace to the extent that she ends up quitting her job because of it. I understand what this instance was doing for the film, but I found the instance of Salma just immediately quitting her job kind of unrealistic. But at the same time, I know it's meant to put across that she's kind of flighty and spontaneous and maybe not as responsible as her friends. Her main ambition is to be a DJ, so I kind of got the idea that she was more looking for a reason to quit her job, that she probably would have done it regardless at some point. I think the way it's presented in the film is that this is being like pushing her buttons for a while, and she was just like looking for an excuse, if that makes sense, which is an interesting way to frame it. I can't say the instances where executive producer intervention was the cause of something or whether it's a decision by the director, but there are moments like that that do feel oddly restrained. It makes watching the film quite odd, I think, because there are moments that feel really quite pertinent and like confronting. So the film like opens with a woman having her legs waxed. The woman waxing this other woman's leg is telling her about how she should be behaving in front of men and in front of her future husband. In a different film, maybe where the characters were white, I'd maybe find this a bit been there, done that, maybe. But I think having these characters who often don't get to speak for themselves or represent themselves, having them open the film immediately and being like, this film's about gender. I don't know if you realize this film is actually about gender. This film might be about gender and gender standards and gender hypocrisy and how it's shitty and awful and we hate it. And it's very confronting to just have a woman's bare leg and then another woman just like very like matter of fact stating that this is how you have to behave because that's just the way it is. It's immediately kind of upsetting, and I think it only gets like heightened by what's in the film. And like I said, I think in the West we're kind of overstuffed with like cinema feminism, I guess, so it can be easy to like take stuff like this for granted. I do think it has a lot to say about the way that films like these have to appeal to familiar ideas for the sake of making their film universal. I think it's very easy for women to understand the standards of grooming and also like the standards that are expected when like trying to get men to like and respect you. Mashing them together is a very surefire way to get a sense of how the film is going to handle other gendered themes in the film. I wanted to point out, during my reading, I came across an article by Yara Hawari, who emphasized that the film being marred by colonization is walking a very fine line between presenting legitimate concerns about gendered violence and misogyny and representing Palestinians as uniquely archaic in their ideas of gender roles and the role of women in general. And I think particularly when representing Arabic people in general, there's a desire to go one way or the other, where either they have like no sense of what is right and what is wrong and it's all kind of chaos, or they're very, very strict, and the intent of both of these representations is to be like alienating for an audience that isn't used to interacting with people who aren't white usually. So often these representations come from a colonizer's perspective on what Arabic people are like. So Yara Hawari says in their article, patriarchy exists in Palestine not only in the form of problematic social dynamics and gendered violence among Palestinians, but also in the form of occupation and settler colonialism. And there's this like desire to conflate any culture that is not directly in front of us with what is like the problem with the role of women in the world, as if we don't also live in a patriarchy and we don't also still have quite archaic views about women ourselves. The extent that these women are having to filter their gender through a colonial experience comes in stuff like incorporating English speech into their everyday lives. So Layla says, I think she says like, fair enough at one point, like in English, and Samar refers to herself and Dunya as lesbians. And I found in a text by Maria Abdel Karim titled Queer Representation in Arab and Middle Eastern Films that within the film, Salma is using the English word lesbian rather than its Arabic translation, which is considered insulting and holds negative connotations to it. There is a huge conversation about whether the word lesbian itself also has incredibly negative connotations to it, but I think what this writer was trying to get at comparatively is that the word lesbian has fewer negative connotations to it than the Arabic translation. And I found so much reading about like the negotiation many Arabic countries have to do when like representing gay identities, especially with like colonialism like hovering over it, because in some contexts the idea of queerness, of being gay and lesbian, it's considered an import from the West. So from Dina Georgis's Thinking Past Pride, they state that queer, gay, lesbian are terminologies that have been imported from the West, where they apply to Western sexual subjects and should not be universalized to represent the sexualities of Arabs. They also go on to say that Arab cultures have given permission to and tolerated same-sex relations as long as they remain unnamed. This context is interesting in that there are particular conceptions of gender and sexuality that we consider progressive, but to the victims of colonization can be interpreted as attempts at erasure. This like goes into conversations about the extent that we see countries in the Middle East as uniquely homophobic, as if this also doesn't work in reverse. Like, whenever there's something wrong with society, people will inevitably blame immigration or the gays, you know? It's kind of in the same boat, I think. It is a universal experience across the world to blame any kind of difference as like the cause of the societal ills. I also do want to respect that, in a sense, there are unique conceptions of queer identities that have to come from the mouths of queer people in those cultures. And I don't think it can be ignored that here the characters have chosen to use an English word. That can't really be ignored here. Something being the product of colonization and also the more positive spin on homosexuality is something that just like kind of has to exist at the same time. It's multitudinous and it's slightly uncomfortable to think about, but I think the extent that we have to mold our identities to the culture that we grow up in and decide what to throw away and what to keep is also a part of the vast human experience. I personally am quite a fan of gay people, so I don't take issue here, and it's also like not my place to reclaim a word that has very negative connotations to it, in the same way that I'm probably not entitled to reclaim most homophobic slurs. It's interesting to see what spots in my knowledge that I have about the world and what I'm bringing to a film. There's a lot that I feel strange about judging the film for, but at the same time I'm kind of operating from this place of this is a nation of people who often just like can't even do the bare minimum of living their lives because they're constantly experiencing colonial violence. And are they going to have the time to unpack every single instance of prejudice when they're living lives that are this unstable? These are questions that I don't actually feel qualified to answer. I do want to bring them up. There is an intense interest in representing religious fundamentalism and the hypocrisy of it and the way this kind of affects how the characters live their lives. I'm going to talk about Samar and her Christianity later, but I think I want to talk about Noor, who is a Muslim character who is religious and is definitely more conservative than her flatmates, but still has to create this illusion of a traditional life because there is an understanding that these standards for women for performing gender correctly are a lot higher. And I think this is kind of exemplified by rape in the film being used as punishment for Noor not conforming, and the extent that this is being put upon her by her fiance as like symbolic of the patriarchal institution of marriage and what that kind of holds for women, and the extent that sexual violence is used as a way to correct behavior is insidious and no doubt a very real thing. In terms of how we are meant to conceive of Palestine here, we are meant to, I guess, view it as a nation ready to change, is presented, it is necessary for change to happen, but that is constantly being pushed back for the sake of maintaining the status quo and the kinds of violence that are being used to keep that in place. Much of the violence isn't actually on screen. I'd say the only real, genuinely upsetting scene is the rape scene. And I think on its own, it's enough to horrify audiences into realizing the extent that this just kind of happens to women. A lot of the time there isn't an avenue to deal with it, either like emotionally because your community won't talk about it, or structurally because it's hard to imagine someone who is a respectable member of the community committing an act of sexual violence in this way.
I can say that The most thing that really touched me when women come and say you are inspiring for us, and I cannot ask for more than this. For if I affected one woman, or not just a woman, of course, we need the men beside us to change the reality.
At its core, In Between is a struggle between modernity and tradition. What I thought was interesting was the lines it kind of blurs between the supposed modern city versus the more traditional villages. So not only does the film use setting as a way to like murky the waters between what is considered a safe space for women, but it also interrogates our idea of who is considered to be more progressive. And I think the conclusion the film kind of comes to is that patriarchy overshadows everything, and this is regardless of progress that is being made. I think it's emphasized in like the real world reaction because, as I mentioned, a fatwa was issued against this film specifically because of the depiction of women smoking and drinking and taking drugs and partying. And those, for all intents and purposes, are presented as just like normal pastimes in the film. So the idea that the real world would have a negative reaction to it is kind of the point that the film is making in the first place. According to The Hollywood Reporter, this was the first Palestinian fatwa in almost 70 years, and some of the strongest attacks came from the village that was actually mentioned in the film, with the municipality issuing a statement condemning the film and barring it from being screened there. So I've mentioned the term fatwa quite a bit, but I haven't defined it yet. And I think when I was looking it up, because I have to be honest, it's not something I'm particularly knowledgeable about. I'm not a religious person and I'm not a Muslim, so I can only really do research and then feed it back. The like public perception of a fatwa is inherently kind of like violent and negative. So the most famous fatwa, when you search it up, which is what I did, is the one issued against Salman Rushdie. I guess as a result, because it was such like a public thing, the word in culture has come to mean the equivalent of a death threat, like a call to action to stop something from occurring. It's the case of like all cultural objects really, because as they come to be associated more and more with different things, words just come to mean different things. I think that's just a result of culture. But I think the fact that many people, particularly like non-Muslims, aren't really invited to learn that much about Islam. So our ideas are mainly informed by movies, TV, and the news. And there are many factors that kind of contribute to them being incentivized to push Islamophobia. It's complicated, really, because on the one hand, I'm sure that words changing to mean something inherently negative when they weren't previously is just kind of a fact of language. But at the same time, how far is this being influenced by ignorance and bigotry? Another question that I have for some reason asked, and I'm not going to be able to answer, am I? Because this is not a history or language podcast, and I actually don't have the answers to those questions. But what I can do is just like define a fatwa in its most literal sense and then like discuss it from sources that I found. So going back to basics, according to the Oxford Islamic Studies online page for fatwa, it was originally intended to explain the finer details of Sharia to those who were not aware of the law. They are like the collective opinions on what Muslims ought to think rather than what Muslims find to be true. And the Washington Post specifically defines a fatwa as a legal opinion on a matter that is raised by a constituent to a mufti, which is a Muslim legal authority. And according to Intisar Rab, the director of Harvard Law School's program in Islamic law, there is no historical instance or basis for calling on members of the general public to exercise vigilante justice, to put someone to death for statements, and for the matter of fact, for someone to follow such directives. Post 9/11, there's been like this kind of perception of Muslims as more violent and brutal than other religions, like far more strict. If you look at it case by case, historically, they're not really any more violent and brutal than any other religion. And I think, a lot of this idea that this was like a serious threat rather than guidance, and it's not even guidance I agree with, like I'm having to defend people who kind of come at this from an Islamophobic place. From what I understand, this was simply guidance to this community to not watch the film. And it was issued by someone who had authority in that area, right? And it's not something I agree with. I think many people would have benefited from watching this film. But at the same time, it's not really any different than a Christian priest advising their community on what charities to support, what stuff to avoid in order to be free from sin. Like, you understand, I think there's something very sensationalized about the way Muslims go about their religion and the way that culturally Arabic people, their instances of, I guess, like genuine bigotry are seen as inherently more violent than anything anyone in the West has come to do. I do think that there is like a fear in more conservative spaces that any depiction of decadent behavior, we'll call it, drinking, doing drugs and partying, is going to be influential. That depicting something on screen is, an endorsement of that behavior. And I wouldn't even argue that that's what the film is doing. I think Hamoud is more interested in just being like, this is probably an average weekend for a lot of young women. Like, Salma's on the DJ, they're celebrating their friend's last night of freedom before she gets married. This is not like shocking behavior. I think with more conservative audiences, that's just like the most absurd thing that anyone could ever depict. And this is like been true of any kind of transgressive piece of art, no matter how mild. I think for like a more tame example, whenever there's like talk of putting gay characters in children's cartoons, there's an uproar from religious groups as well. And I think it's just a reaction to change, a reaction to the way that your community is going to be perceived from then on. And I think within the film itself, there is this kind of an anticipation of criticism. The Muslim character Noor, one of the main three girls, is kind of meant to symbolize the more traditional aspects of womanhood, and as a result, Layla and Salma are kind of mocking and looking down on her for not really conforming to their more modern lifestyle. And I think there's this air of superiority despite the fact they are both kind of experiencing the pushback of this modern lifestyle in real time. But they have this kind of mission to have Noor loosen up and be more free. The idea that Noor would be as dedicated to her religion is kind of implicitly her letting down the side. Despite the fact that Noor is quite modern in a lot of senses, she's not as outgoing as the other two girls. She also has to perform some of the more traditional aspects for when her fiance comes to visit, because she doesn't conform all the way. And I think there's a lot that's taken for granted in the balancing act of trying to uphold your cultural beliefs and also adapt them to a world that expects you to do that, and also not be a stick in the mud or a buzzkill. And the difficulty with which all of these characters seem to have with this task is like really interesting, and it's what connects them all together. In a sense, the Muslim woman has come to be symbolic of tradition itself, which is quite common in representing Islam on screen. There is a sense that by wearing a hijab and being quite stringent with the way you do your religion, that you're kind of letting the team down, and that the ultimate goal for the Muslim woman in a movie is to eventually take off her hijab and be free of the constraints of a patriarchal system. The way religion is presented in the film is patriarchal and is definitely oppressive, but I did also respect that it didn't have any of the characters disavow their religions, really, and that it kind of refused to fall into the tropes that are kind of put on Arabic women to inherently see a more westernized version of the world as the one that's more progressive. So there's this really good article from Maria bint Rehan where they talked about how the hijab itself, although it's come to be perceived as a patriarchal item, specifically there to hold women back, this writer argues that it's not anchored in a value system which privileges a superficial beauty or the charms of fashion, and its notion of exclusivity or being seen. Like Islam, the hijab demands more of us intellectually and morally. I think the way that it's used in the film is interesting because it goes in and out of being a like performative aspect in, I guess, the same way that the way anyone dresses would be. But I think this is all within the context of a film that is trying to point out how women come to make decisions about how they're going to live their lives. I guess the perspective that modesty is also a choice in the same way that dressing any other way would be, is one that I think a lot of feminists struggle to come to terms with. The idea that someone would want to shift focus away from a physical part of themselves is still kind of seen as something being enacted upon women rather than a choice that's being made by them for the sake of their own autonomy. And it's not like there aren't instances in the film where Noor isn't wearing a hijab, it's mostly indoors. The film argues that it's going to have to be a blend and that not everything is worth throwing out, that there are aspects of the world that are there for pleasure, that are there for joy, that are there because they have significance, because they have histories attached to them. There is kind of a messy aspect in that. Is the film arguing that being Palestinian is something inherently regressive and holding women back from existing in the modern world? And I think the film is able to kind of blur these lines with the character of Layla, who is by all accounts a very modern woman. She's a lawyer and I think she's an atheist. I don't think she really says, but she regularly smokes, and she is also still beholden to gendered expectations of her. The very progressive man who she meets asks her to change things about herself if he's going to continue seeing her. I think that is like a stark record scratch for the movie, in that just because there is no religion attached to this situation does not mean that patriarchy isn't being enacted on this situation. And, you know, there are like moments of freedom where they all share this kind of common joy, like Noor dancing in the living room to the song that she heard earlier in the car, and Layla wearing a hijab, I guess, for what looks like the first time. There's like an exchange between these women. There has to be this kind of blend. If they're going to get along, if culturally they're going to be able to sustain the history as Palestinians, there has to be this kind of blend with an acute focus on how they're being affected by gendered expectations. One of my favorite moments in the film is towards the end, where we see Noor's father, who, after he finds out that Noor and Wissam's engagement is off, he is very understanding and he doesn't blame her at all. This is contrasted with Salma's father, who goes out of his way to try and reassert control of her life by saying that she can't be a lesbian and that he's going to choose who she marries. It feels quite deliberate, and I think it's structured in a specific way where we're kind of bracing for impact of Noor's father to be absolutely furious that her engagement is off, but he holds no hatred or anger towards her at all, which is like in complete contrast to Salma's father, who is actually violent with her. And I think in both instances there's this aspect of religious tradition being enacted on their lives, but also just like culturally, what are we being asked of these two religions? What are our expectations for these religions, and how far are they correct? Are modernity and tradition just words at the end of the day? Because though these women have found community with one another, in what sense are their lives going to be better after the events of this film? In Brian Whitaker's book, Unspeakable Love, Gay and Lesbian Life in the Middle East, the author states that homosexuality is a subject that Arabs, even reform-minded Arabs, are generally reluctant to discuss. If mentioned at all, it's treated as a subject for ribald laughter, or more often as a foul, unnatural, repulsive, un-Islamic Western perversion. Now, I have talked a bit earlier about the way that queerness is seen as like a Western import, and that it wouldn't naturally exist in these communities if everyone was following the rules and doing what they were meant to be doing, which I think is interesting because in the West, the opposite can also be said, that any kind of degeneracy can be applied to the other. The idea of the exotic Middle Eastern community can be seen from a Western perspective as a type of perversion in itself. There's this like interesting relationship with how people want to pass the buck and just not acknowledge that some people are gay, and this is regardless of what God they believe in or where they're actually born. Samar Habib wrote in Female Homosexuality in the Middle East, Histories and Representation, that lesbianism is often treated as a kind of secondary and unusual phenomenon. And in terms of how queer cinema in Palestine and the Middle East in general comes to be, it is not a straightforward kind of history, and I don't think colonialism or Western influences can be left out of it, really, because I think it's quite hard to locate Palestinian cinema. It's quite hard to produce it in the first place because a lot of the world doesn't want to acknowledge that Palestine exists. but also it's hard to produce cultural artifacts when you're working under the shadow of colonialism, which is trying to suppress the idea that you exist. And I've read a lot from critics who have come to argue that it's hard to talk about meaningful issues like race and sexuality and feminism when you can't even get like a baseline quality of life. It's a really morbid fact, but I think there's this idea that, and this was like really common when people were discussing queer people's support for Palestine in the past couple of months, that there is something inherently bigoted about these places, that if you were gay and you went there, then you would be in a lot of danger, as if living in my country right now is incredibly dangerous for trans people. And I assume we're moving back into another wave of homophobia. I'm going to try and not make this about the West because I want to focus on the film, but there's this idea that we are inherently more progressive, that we are like a civilizing force for countries like these. But it is baffling, truly baffling, to see people talk about cultures that they have no interest in or no information on, and an absolute refusal to engage with the very dangerous politics that are happening right now in our own countries, right? So there's this idea that we are great and they're not, which is just being a fact of being alive, I guess, for forever. But what I'm getting at is that there's nothing inherently more bigoted about these countries, especially because they have not had the emancipation that's been needed in order to create a genuine, varied, queer cinema canon, right? So in Maria Abdel Karim's book, Queer Representation in Arab and Middle Eastern Films, she states that queer representation in Arab cinema has been present since the 1930s, but always in coded forms. Egypt's most famous director, Youssef Chahine, included gay representations or characters in many of his films, such as two males dancing together or exchanging long seductive looks. This type of homosexuality allows filmmakers in countries where queer representation is censored to stretch the rules and imply that certain characters may be queer through the way they dress, speak, or behave, rather than being explicitly mentioned. Most Middle Eastern films which tackle the subject of homosexuality have been funded or co-produced by Western countries, mainly France. Conservative, homophobic Arabs consider the Western funding of Arab films a distorting force on the reality of Arab culture that goes on to present Arabs as sexually explicit in ways that appeal to European audiences. So I think that's a more concise and articulate way of what I was trying to get at, which is that there is a legitimate concern that what cinema is being produced is being influenced by outside culture, but that outside culture is always influencing the parts of ourselves that we want to disavow. We don't want to acknowledge the things that are actually shitty, we just want to acknowledge the things that we ourselves find disgusting and uncomfortable. In terms of like actual legality of what is allowed within Palestine, I'm going to be getting this from multiple sources, which I'll put in the description, but I just want to give like a brief rundown. Under the British Mandate Criminal Code Ordinance of 1936, same-sex sexual activity is prohibited in Gaza. To explain the British Mandate Criminal Code Ordinance, we have to explain Mandatory Palestine, which was created by the British. After an Arab rising against the Ottoman Empire arose during the First World War in 1916, British forces drove Ottoman forces out of the Levant. The United Kingdom had agreed in the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence that it would honour Arab independence in case of a revolt, but in the end, the United Kingdom and France divided what had been Ottoman Syria under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, an act of betrayal in the eyes of the Arabs. As a result, it is down to the British playing a prominent role in colonization that homophobia was exported to the state of Palestine. The relevant provisions for the legality of same-sex relations carries a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment, and only men are criminalized under this law. It continues to be in operation in Gaza today, though it is not in force elsewhere in Palestine. There is little evidence of the law being enforced, and it appears to be largely obsolete in practice. I also want to point out that Section 28 was only abolished in, I think, like 2005. I would not argue that my country is as progressive as it thinks it is. And I've spoken in many episodes the way that legality is still very much intertwined with the way people in the LGBT community have to navigate the world. Like, it hasn't gone away. And I think I want liberation for queer people all around the world, and refusing to acknowledge the humanity of people because you think they might be bigoted, especially when they are very literally right now being slaughtered by the government, is heinous and truly batshit behavior. There's a really good article in Gay Times where they interview Dr. Syed Atshan, who basically broke down what people in the West get wrong about these situations. And I'm just going to read basically everything that he said because he's more articulate than me right now. He starts with this: how are Palestinians supposed to build a truly democratic, pluralistic society in which women or queer people can be treated with respect and can gain equality as long as we remain under a brutal regime? Palestinians live in this broader context of Israeli oppression and repression, which is much more difficult for feminist activists and queer activists to realize the dreams and visions that they have for Palestine. The Israeli Zionist political project is an ethnocratic project that privileges one ethno-religious group above all and enfranchises them with superior rights. I coined this term of ethno-heteronormativity, that queer Palestinians have to face an ethnocratic-based system and a heteronormative system that are intersecting and enact certain forms of oppression at the same time. I'm quite aware that I just front-loaded a load of context about laws and the way queerness is perceived and the way the West perceives queer Palestinians, but I just think that the context for what the film is presenting is important, because I don't know that the film goes into that much depth, and I would argue, and I don't mean this as an insult, that the queer aspects of the story are deliberately quite safe and palatable. And that's not to say that it's not hard to watch, but I think if you're someone who watches a lot of gay cinema, you're aware of the scene where someone comes out to a family member and is rejected. Like, I think we've seen that quite a few times. We've seen homophobic bullying and harassment and actual violence so much that putting it in the movie, it's not very didactic in breaking down the way that Palestinians specifically view the LGBT community. And I'd argue that the film kind of goes out of its way to present the homophobic views as archaic, because Salma and Dunya and their one friend, whose name I can't remember, but he is in it quite a bit, are shown to be able to be out for the most part. We don't see too much of their sexuality out in public, but amongst their friend group, there is a kind of safety. Presenting a kind of queer narrative that is familiar doesn't ask too much of an audience that may be unfamiliar with all of the stuff that I just mentioned before. That specifically the way that queer people in Palestine are affected by multiple oppressions at the same time. Salma not being able to speak Arabic at her place of work and her being rejected by her father, they don't happen at the same time. They're quite far apart in the narrative. Now, they both happen to the same character. It is still kind of this idea that of ethno-heteronormativity. It's not like a double force both at the same time kind of situation. Salma's narrative is that she is being her true self, like she's being a DJ and she's working her day job. She's quite transgressive. She has like a back tattoo and nose rings and lip piercings, and she has to dress a different way when she's around her parents. Her mother specifically asked her to wear a dress. She is constantly having to meet prospective husbands. She rejects all of them, and initially her father is quite impressed that she's as picky as she is, but when it turns out that she's actually a lesbian, this fact becomes something he uses against her, which is like kind of awful and sinister. So she meets her girlfriend Dunya while bartending, and it's quite cute. You know, she gives Dunya a free shot, and they are gonna go home that night, but they're kind of interrupted by Layla throwing up in the street. So they decide to reschedule and meet up later. And I think there's a part of me that wishes this whole plot was more developed, that we saw more of their relationship. But I do think it's quite sweet that Salma takes Dunya home with her, and she like shows her old school. It is kind of the cause of a very upsetting scene in the film where her father slaps her in the face and threatens to send her to the madhouse. And the film kind of ends with her planning to just move to Berlin, and we don't know her fate at the end of the film, which is true of all of the women. There's this idea that there is no safety here, and I suppose like the planned escape at the end is meant to emphasize that even in Tel Aviv, the supposedly more progressive part, there is still too much bigotry to cope with. And the film kind of posits that maybe the only end is to just escape. I know that my Saloon Hamoud stated in one of the interviews I read from her that Thelma and Louise was an influence when creating this film, and the way that film ends is, not to spoil it, but the two women at the end choose to escape their fate as well. So whilst this is more straightforward and less action heavy, I think there is a sense that leaving a situation that is abusive and harmful is probably the most radical thing you can do, you know, for the sake of self-preservation. And in terms of like queer identities, I think it does feel as though this is written from someone who is looking to empathize rather than display their own experience. And I think the like hard and fast rule that bigotry is wrong, that violence is wrong, that these regressive politics are wrong, they're all kind of blended together. And I think there's this idea that gender liberation will bring about other kinds of liberation. There is a lot to be done, and that it all has to be done. It can't be done one bit at a time, because the progressive modern city is just hiding the murky, more bigoted underbelly that nobody wants to think about but is causing real harm. And that just has to include homophobia inside of that. I've spoken for a very long time, once again, but that's okay, because I'm going to ask the question, does this film look like a badger? There's a lot in here that is very transgressive, and as a starting point, it's a very good one. I would argue that there's a lot more that I would have liked, particularly from the lesbian part of the story. But I also know that it's a lot to put on the shoulders of one film. I think an Arabic woman talking about being Palestinian in a colonized country and criticizing patriarchy in the process is kind of groundbreaking. There aren't that many films like this that exist. It is more restrained than I would have liked. Now, I'm not asking for like a sex scene, but just more emphasis on romance and desire. The actual romance part of the queer romance in the film feels a bit absent. But I also think that it's a good first step, and my hope is that more Palestinian filmmakers are able to talk about queer desire and queer joy. That's the kind of cinema that I want in the future. I'm going to give some recommendations. They're quite varied and as I've said throughout, they're obviously quite limited by my own knowledge. I can tell you now, I haven't watched that many films that center on Arabic narratives, on Muslim characters. Part of doing this podcast has really asked a lot of me. My hope is that I'm able to find more films like this one. Take my recommendations with a pinch of salt. I'm only one person, as always. The first film I'm going to recommend, Holy Spider. It is an incredibly brutal film, not for the light-hearted, which is why for some reason I decided to recommend it first. So it's about a serial killer who is murdering sex workers and a journalist who is trying to uncover and have this man prosecuted whilst fighting a culture that seems to be encouraging the behaviour that he is enacting. It's bleak and very candid with its depiction of gendered violence, and it genuinely made me really upset to watch. It's not a feel-good film in any way, but I think it has a lot to say about women and sexuality and the ways these have functioned within Islam, which I thought was really interesting. And I do think it's worth the watch, but only if you have quite a strong stomach, because like I said, it doesn't pull any punches. The second film that I'm going to recommend is a film that everyone recommends when recommending films about Muslim women, because it was kind of similarly groundbreaking in terms of genre and representation. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. There is a very large chance that you've heard of this one or you've already watched it yourself. It is constantly mentioned in discussions about depicting Muslim women. So it's basically about a vampire who is stalking the streets on her skateboard, and she's making everyone's time really, really bad. Unfortunately, this, for me, is the only film I've liked from this director. There's a lot stylistically to like, and I do think it's worth a watch for simply the fact that there is a woman in a veil drinking people's blood and she's just like skateboarding around. It's fun. There is a lot to like about it, especially in terms of genre. And the last film I'm going to recommend, a film called Children of Shatila. It is a documentary about children from Palestine who had to flee to Lebanon, and the director basically gave them all cameras to talk about their experience, film each other, talk about what they wanted from the future, what they wanted Palestine to be. It's incredibly important filmmaking, I think, deeply relevant, and it's very easy for us to disconnect ourselves from the current moment. Either you're having too much being flooded into your eye view, you're having constant snuff being put on your timeline, and you're constantly having to think about it, or you're completely disengaged. And I think both of these instances kind of invite us to not see the people in Palestine as humans. As bad as that sounds, I think there's a level of disconnect that we're encouraged to have in situations like this. And I think documentaries like Children of Shatila very much ground this in the real world. It's incredibly important that films like this exist and that people watch them. I'd like to thank you very much for listening. I will be back shortly with more bonus episodes covering new releases, as well as my regularly scheduled deep dive in June. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter at LikeABadgePod. Follow me on Spotify, YouTube and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. Make sure you check out the bonus episode I posted in March to hear my opinions on new queer releases. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can find my writing at ambergunwalk.com. All of my sources are in the description. I would like to encourage you, before I go, to donate to some of the pages I've put in the description to provide aid for the people of Palestine. Thank you again for listening. I hope to see a free Palestine in my lifetime.